Good afternoon, Sean here from Mountains Garage in the beautiful state of Maine. It's the second day back from vacation. After yesterday's video, I gave myself the afternoon off and did what I normally do, watch YouTube videos. And it's 95% people working on cars. And I find myself watching the bad habits that exist. Everybody has them. I have them, I'm sure. I made an oath to myself a long time ago to try to learn from those I admire, which I did, and always be open for better ways to do the same thing. Whether you see somebody else do it that way and you say, hey, that's easier than the way I do it, or you're a trendsetter, pioneer, and you find ways to do it yourself that are more efficient. Today's subject is going to be drivetrain removal. I've spent most of my career, started as a transmission R&I guy at two different transmission shops. One of them was a complete and utter swamp. It was an old car wash. You'd go home at night with speedy dry up to your knees. When it rained, it poured in that place. The next shop was brand new. It was white with nearly white cement floors, and they frowned on any mess because it was a waste of time. Handprints, all that stuff, anything unprofessional, that's not what they were all about. And that's a good atmosphere to learn in when you're young. It was while I was young that I heard a phrase from a guy that owned his own shop. And it went something like this: he pays the professionals a professional wage, and he pays the grease monkey less. So I thought about that and tried to lean toward having, a clean uniform, clean hands, present an appearance so when I'm presented with my check at the end of the week, I have more to put in the bank. It really is that simple. That's the way the world works. Sometimes image has a lot to do with it. The bottom line, anyway. And yes, I understand the irony sitting here in front of the camera in my dirty shop coat. But at this point in my life, I control my own destiny, whether I make a dime or not. And I'm not sure image has a lot to do with it, because I don't interact with a lot of people even these days, which is fine with me. Occasionally somebody drops off a transmission or a rear end, and I don't think they care what I look like, but maybe I'll rethink that as well. But let's get to the basics, the important stuff. Step one, when you bring a vehicle into your service bay, you open the hood, period. Because if things go wrong, most vehicles, the battery, which you hopefully disconnect while you're doing any drivetrain removal, a lot of people don't, is under the hood. Not only that, when I was a transmission removal guy, the natural light or the artificial light would put up on top of the bell housing so it was shining down makes a big difference. There's nothing hard about removing a transmission unless you make it that way. I worked in the first transmission shop. We had the old scary lifts. The second shop, the big fancy one, we didn't have any lifts, and I worked there 6 or 7 years. Laying on the ground, on creepers, which teaches you a lot about jack stand placement and how to work efficiently on your back. Obviously, the old dot is on the lift, but I'm going to continue to talk about jack stands. This is not a stock car. There's not a jacking post halfway down the rocker panel with an arrow pointed to it like there is on TV. I can't think of very many situations, and I've seen people crush the frame in like a Caprice or an Impala or a Chevelle, anything with a really thin frame, G-body, GM, that runs down behind the rocker panel. They'll put the floor jack halfway down the door, jack it up, and squish the frame. It was never meant to jack there, and probably in the owner's manual, they didn't give you a lot of guidance. Nowadays, especially foreign cars, they do give you jacking points, mostly to put on lifts, but it would be acceptable if you had to. If I was on the side of the road and had a small floor jack, I didn't have the factory jack, and I jacked under the frame rail, that'd be one thing, but the pinch weld on a car like this, you're just gonna crush it. Jack stand placement. While the lift goes right here, I can't count almost everybody. You watch them jack up a vehicle, put the jack stand right here next to the transmission, and then try to pull the transmission out. You don't have to do that. You got an entire front suspension. You can find a place to put a jack stand. Anywhere, just not where you're working. Seems like common sense, but as you start watching videos, keep an eye on that. I've always enjoyed the fact that GM gave you a nice generous spot, and this one's been used quite a bit probably, to jack up the front of the car. And if I was putting jack stands, I'd put them right here and load the front suspension. Under the rear, you can choose to put it under the rear end housing, which fits right into the jack stand nicely and is completely safe. Or if you want the rear end to hang down for any reason, you could put it under the frame. But just keep them out of the way. That's my point in this whole exercise. Give yourself room to work. One less thing to be frustrated about. And when you watch a guy be told to load up his toolbox and leave and never come back because he put handprints all over a Mercedes, dragging himself out from under the car, removing the transmission, that sticks with you too. Be professional. Your handprints shouldn't be on anything. Next, you need a plan, and it matters whether you're pulling just the motor, just the transmission, or both. Other than times where I've been junkyarding and we were stripping a bunch of crashed vehicles, just wanted the motor and transmissions, and we pulled them out with a tractor complete, I've never pulled a motor and transmission together. I've never saw the need to. I think it's a complete waste of time. You're just gonna make more mistakes that way, but that's just me. If I'm have an empty engine and transmission bay, I'm gonna lower the engine down, bolt it up, put a small block of wood to keep it from tilting down, put it up in the lift and go underneath and put the transmission in. Oil pans that are made of metal, thin metal, I never meant to jack on. If you have to, at least put a block of wood under it. That's another giant mistake I see. Or they'll pull an engine out and set it right on the floor. All you're doing is pushing the pan into the oil pickup, and it's going to cause you trouble later on. They're not strong enough to support the whole rig. If you have an aluminum pan, a cast aluminum pan, that's a different story. That's very rugged, and it'll do a pretty good job. You got to get the fluids out of it. If you're pulling the engine, you're dealing with several fluids. The biggest mess people make is the coolant. Get the radiator out of it, and while you have it up in the air, there's block drains on, at least on a small or big block Chevy. There is on an LS, but it's a really big plug and it's a pain to get out. But it's still better than belching coolant all over the floor every time that engine goes beyond horizontal. But on a small or big block Chevy or anything with a block drain, they're halfway down the oil pan rail. You take them out and drain all the coolant out. Or if you live in a part of the country where you have water in it, and you're going to store that engine with just water in it, you'd be much better off to get it all out of there. So I don't want to swim in fluids. So I want to control each one. The engine oil itself doesn't pose that much of a problem. Transmission fluid, on the other hand, I have cores sitting around here with fluid leaking out of them all the time because people didn't drain them when they pulled them out. I wish they did, but if you're not going to drain it, if it's not part of the job, you can't charge for that if it's a paying job. Transmission-wise, obviously pull the drive shaft. If you have a bunch of yokes sticking around, you'll solve that. If you watch me do anything, I plug every hole, preferably with a threaded plug if it's a threaded hole. Even brake lines I plug. I don't want fluid going everywhere. It also causes me more work if I have to bleed the whole system again, where I could have just capped it for a 10-cent plug. I collect boxes and boxes over the years of plugs to plug every port. If you don't have that, you can use masking tape. Most of the engine shouldn't be exposed. I mean, the exhaust ports, you always got a couple exhaust valves open. I just watched a video the other night where a guy had a brand new engine, big block Chevy, supposed to make a lot of power. He has it sitting in the new chassis and they're grinding on making headers right next to it and the thing's wide open. A fool and his money are soon parted. Isn't that how the saying goes? But again, it's all about keeping the dirt out and the fluid in. Another common mistake that I see over and over again is use of the engine crane itself. You want the shortest possible chain connection from the ram on the engine crane to whatever your lifting device is. I want my engine crane right here. Having a long chain, I was watching this guy the other night fight because his engine crane was hitting his garage door and he couldn't close the door. And he had 1.5 feet of chain dangling off there. Problem solved. Short hook. Never fails. For instance, I installed the engine in this 71 Nova without removing the hood. Using that same lifting plate I just showed you, hooked up just the way I described. It went right in. I seldom, if ever, remove a hood. I'm typically working by myself. If I do need more clearance, I will, of course, mark it like you should, so you know where to put it back. I'll take the forward bolt out, loosen the back, and just pivot the hood away from the hinge. That usually does the trick. It is nice with it off. It does give you a lot more light, but it's one more thing you got to deal with if you're in a hurry or working by yourself. I think I mentioned the last time I was under the hood of the Dodge Dart is I've never had a vehicle that had flat inner fenders and you'd have a tendency to set things on them and then eventually knock it off, hopefully not down through the radiator. I watched a video last night that the guy had his intake and valve covers off and he had all the nuts and bolts sitting right on the cowl ahead of the windshield over the engine. That's a recipe for disaster. I mean, these magnetic trays are what, $3 a piece at your local cheap tool store? They're a great idea, but I don't use the car as a workbench. I don't care if it's just a rat rod that has, rust all over it. I suppose that might make it look more beautiful if you did scratch it up, but you see a lot of people using the vehicle as a workbench, tools all over the fenders, throwing stuff all around. Hey, it's their vehicle, they can do what they want. If it's not my vehicle, and I've worked on some pretty nice vehicles, I'm certainly not going to get in that habit. That's a bad habit. Have yourself a nice area to put stuff, because there's going to be stuff coming and going. Keep it all in one spot. Organization saves so much time. I know, again, I see the irony in it, but believe it or not, this is organized. There's just a lot of stuff in here. I had the pleasure of working with a guy who is now passed on. He was the most efficient man I'd ever met. And he had some really good advice. Your work area and your tools, I've said this before, are what's important. The jobs come and go constantly. Make your focus on your work area, neat and clean, tools where they belong, and you'll be faster. This guy worked flat rate and he killed it every day, and you never saw him really hustling or anything. He was just steady as she goes. We could work on vehicles that I worked at the Chrysler dealer. Nights and weekends you could work on your own stuff. He showed up on 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. I was building a 396 in my pickup across the bay. He pulled in, he was a Ford guy. Had an F-250, four-wheel drive. He'd built another engine for it, so the new engine was all ready to go. He showed up slightly after 10 o'clock, and at noontime he was gone. And he swapped the engine in a Ford F-250, mid-70s. And that's pretty impressive if you ask me. Back to, I mentioned the video I watched yesterday, I think it was, that brand new big block Chevy, super expensive, and they're grinding right next to it. Who do you think will get blamed when that engine goes bad? The engine builder. It happens more often, but the engine builder is savvy enough to know it didn't leave his shop full of metal. So that's just the way it goes. So hey, I hope if you're a beginner or an experienced guy, never stop learning. I learned today. I learned while I was shooting this video that there's always room to improve yourself. If you don't think that way, it might be time to either start doing so or find something else that makes you happy. Thanks for watching. This video just kind of hit me, and now it's done. I'm going to put it out there. Good, bad, right or wrong. And then I'll catch you in a couple days and maybe we'll actually be doing something. Because I gave myself a couple more hours off this afternoon to shoot the video. I really should do something.